This is the School Leadership Show, the only podcast dedicated to helping practicing and aspiring school leaders improve their craft. The School Leadership Show brings together thought leaders from inside and outside of education to deliver you the insights and tools you need to succeed in school leadership. In this episode, sometimes co-host Dan White and I get into all things teams, how to build them, how to think about the larger context, and much more. Enjoy this conversation with Dan White. Welcome back. I'm here with Dan White, and we are continuing our conversation from a podcast or two ago, depending on how things shook out. And this one is going to be a little bit more narrowly focused. We're going to talk about building your leadership team. Not team building, different. We're talking about building basically your command staff in the parlance of the military and the police world. What do you think, Dan?
I think that if you have the ability as a leader to hire your team or parts of your team, it's of great benefit, but you shouldn't squander that opportunity.
I think about in your one of your recent roles, you pretty much were able to hire your entire cabinet.
Over time, and I think that you have to think about it a couple different ways. You're going to, when you take on a leadership position, you're going to inherit some people, and you need to spend some time getting to know them and understanding their strengths, understanding what they bring to the table, and you shouldn't outwardly dismiss that. I would never say that because, Mike, you were part of that leadership team. We had a lot of existing parts, if you will, that were fantastic. Part of that, I think, is evaluating what doesn't exist and what's needed by the organization.
So as you were thinking about it, so I think back to, it would have been shortly before you hired me. And because, was I your first cabinet hire?
You were.
I was. So see if you can get in the Wayback Machine and talk about your thinking when you were knowing, like you got to look out past the horizon to see, who's going to retire, who might move on, what, as you're building this team moving forward, because you're not hiring for just that one position right now. You're thinking longer term. So talk about your thinking during that initial process.
I think you're not only hiring longer term, but you have some immediate needs which may or may not be met by an individual. And then you have, where do you want the organization to go? And there's a delicate balance there. You can easily get pressure to hire internally for immediate needs, and you shouldn't dismiss internal hires out of hand. But the idea was, there's a couple of things that, Mike, I felt our organization needed was some direction instructionally long term, and the ability to shift we're an ESA, of course, so shift some of our services to better meet some of our district needs long term.
People might not know what an ESA is.
Well, an educational service agency. So we are an intermediate unit. There's multiple different ways to call it in the United States, but we provided professional development services and school improvement services to districts, provided technology to districts, and we also had a number of student-based programs where we had academic and instructional needs ourselves. That was an identified need. So the question is, if that's an identified need, how do you look at that both presently and into the future? And how do you evolve the organization to meet that need? I had one position open. It was a technology position, which you were hired for. But the long-term idea was eventually, with your instructional background, we're going to meld the two, because I think we all felt strongly that technology and instruction should be part of the two sides of the same coin instead of two different coins.
Agreed. So at that point, so when you're thinking big picture about building that team, and we alluded to this in our last podcast about how do you overcome that natural human tendency to gravitate toward hiring people who look and think like you. Because I would argue we're two middle-aged white guys.
Yes.
So talk to me about that.
So I think one thing that helped me is I came from a non-traditional background. I was never a classroom teacher. and I probably moved up through the administrative ranks quickly or too quickly. In fact, I would tell people jokingly or not jokingly that I was never fully qualified for any job I've ever taken. However,
Well, the first time I got tenure was as a principal.
that's correct. Yes, and you were what, 28 years old?
Yes. 28.
Something like that. So, skill sets don't necessarily are not commensurate with tenure and vice versa, or length of stay, vice versa. But I think the honest look at what does the organization need, how do I facilitate hiring for that, honestly, and what is the long-term opportunities that you have within an organization, or let's say if you're a principal within your building or your program or what have you.
So, as you moved forward, so you had opportunities to hire more cabinet level folks,
Yep.
and I think back on the next one was your business official.
Business official. And the intent was to hire somebody who could have business and operational control of the organization from a logistics and facility standpoint. So you need somebody with that background.
And you found someone from a smaller school district,
Small school district.
with that entire constellation of experiences.
It did, and we did actually. And I think I'm a big believer, Mike, that leadership translates. Whether you're in a small organization or a large organization, the ability to lead, to plan, to articulate goals, and to lead them through to fruition is a skill set that translates. It may take a while in a larger organization to do that, but people who've had to do the job in a smaller organization, to me, often lead to the ability to do the job in a larger organization. But it was a blessing. I mean, there was the opportunity to look again at what the organization needed.
So when you're in that position of, okay, we have an opening. Somebody has retired, somebody has moved on, there's this opening. And this is a conversation that you and I have had many, many times about not artificially or arbitrarily limiting the potential candidate pool from the outset. Now, if you are hiring a high school principal, you have to have someone who is certified to be a high school principal.
Correct.
But if you're more on the operations side of the house, I think about HR director postings. So when you think about that in New York State, you can be on one of two sides of the house in a school district. You're either certificated, teacher, principal, teaching assistant, things like that, or you are civil service. So the other side of the house. So we intentionally posted our HR director position to be either certified or civil service. You want to talk more about that?
Sure, and I think it goes back to the ability to be planful when you hire, because there's a lot of folks that will think when someone retires, you're going to post a position exactly as is. So an interim gives you a little bit of space once in a while to think about what you really need as an organization. So let's talk about human resources. So
wait, before you go there though, I think that's a bigger point that we need to stick a pin in right there, because I think any opening, particularly at the cabinet or even at that director level, requires an element of pause. So that opening is going to exist. So at that point, you take a step back and look at it. Is this an opportunity to reorganize? Do we need to reduce a position? Do we need to add a position? Is this the right position to continue? And I think a lot of places, and you sort of mentioned it before, just as a matter of course, we have an opening posted. Instead of taking a moment, taking a breath, and thinking about that position and how it fits in the greater context and where the organization is headed.
Right. So how can you create that breath? Because the unknown is difficult for individuals. It's difficult for a faculty. It's difficult for an organization. And I can tell you at a cabinet level position, it's difficult for a board of education. So they want to know, what are you going to do? So clearly articulating, listen, we want to take a step back. We want to look at the needs of the organization. We want to get input. We want to be able to make sure we're making the good decision is always advisable. People don't like the unknown. They want to know who their boss is. In the case of a board, they want to know who the key employees are. And again, it goes, one of our things that we talk about in the presentation is not letting somebody else's crisis become your crisis. Take the time you need to make important decisions. You can't take 2 years to do this.
Right.
But a couple of months, a month or two, to engage people. What are the qualities and characteristics we're looking for? What do we need to have done?
Well, and this is a good opportunity for a bird walk because you mentioned it. So putting an interim in there, it might not necessarily be the worst option because you might have a sense of where a particular department or a wing of the agency needs to go, but it might be something that's too strenuous to make a new employee do. So you bring in a seasoned veteran, perhaps an administrator out of retirement, to spend 6 or 8 months in there as an interim to clean house, to line things up, get things ready to go, so it's set up for a new employee to take over.
Well, and I think the key to hiring an interim for a position, number one in my book is, Mike, you and I have this experience with interim superintendents. They can't want the job.
Correct.
They need to be able to objectively look at systems in that department, in that building, in that organization, and say, here are some recommendations. And they have to keep doing the job as well. But
they also have to be very clear at the outset that they are going to leave.
They're going to leave.
They have a shelf life, and they will not be staying in perpetuity.
Their job is to facilitate a hire.
Yes.
That gives whomever the decision maker is in that situation the opportunity to reflect, to gather input, and to think about big picture restructuring organizational things that allows them to make a decision that is forward thinking rather than just replacing. Now, again, you mentioned if you have a high school principal that left, you're not going to not hire a high school principal.
You have to have a high school principal.
So, however, an interim does give you the ability to engage the faculty and the community and your parents and even your students on, hey, what do we need in this building? What are the things that we should be thinking about? What are the things that we need to do to move this building forward?
Let's talk about the difference between interim and acting. I'm going to parse that out a little bit.
And acting would be the classic battlefield promotion, right?
An assistant principal.
You have someone that left unexpectedly, and you have to have someone.
High school principal leaves in January.
And you didn't expect it, and you have to have you promote one of your assistant principals because somebody's got to sign the paperwork and make the decisions for the forthcoming near future. An interim is a longer term commitment that is designed around a specific end date that allows you to design a process.
It has a built-in transition.
It has a built-in transition. Oftentimes those interims, if you hire well as an interim, they can serve in a quasi-mentoring role or pass along some information to the executive that allows them to be more successful. And acting is, I had a principal leave yesterday. I need someone who's acting in the building today.
Right.
Very different.
And you might have an acting then leading to an interim.
You would. And in some cases, some organizations have someone who acts as superintendent in the absence of the superintendent. So if the superintendent is overseas on vacation and something happens and someone needs to sign something, there's someone who can sign as an acting superintendent. It's a very short-term process. And people sometimes get wary of the whole interim thing or taking a step back in the process because they want to know. However, it does give, again, decision-making perspective to the executive in charge.
But when it comes to recruiting, this is a thing that scares me. And we're, where I work, we're going to be in the market shortly for a director position that is going to be very difficult to fill. It's a niche area.
Yes.
There's not a lot of people out there. And having an interim in there over time gives us more time to recruit, to get out there, to beat the bushes a little bit. But another thought on the interim piece, and I think this is something that I really didn't sort of notice until recently. So we have an interim director who at one point in his career had been a superintendent. And I almost feel like that's a benefit. Putting somebody in an interim role who maybe finished his or her career at a higher position and then sort of takes an interim role at a lower position not lower, you know what I mean, right? So different on the org chart, but really gets how the larger system functions and then can work with that particular department to not bring them in line isn't the term, but basically to help that department function within the larger system because that interim was in charge of a larger system.
So, like, I had the benefit of when I came into an organization which was much larger than any I had worked in before, tenfold.
So you went from superintendent as a school district of how many students?
About 1,000 students.
How many employees?
150.
Okay, and then you went to an organization with how many employees?
About 1,500.
1,500, okay.
And about 10 times the budget, too. So, again, leadership stuff should transfer, but it was helpful for me to have interims who had been superintendents, etc., who could say, if I'm sitting in your shoes, these are the things I'm thinking about. So think about that. If you're a superintendent, if you're a principal, an interim, it takes...
even bringing in somebody who retired as a high school principal, bringing them as an interim assistant principal.
Of course, because
they're going to have a different view of the world.
They know their perspective and the decision-making apparatus that you exist in. And they understand the different constituencies from your global perspective, which is different than a district-wide global perspective, but they understand how you're trying to make decisions. It is helpful as long as they can understand that they still work for you, and that's a catch.
It's a catch.
That's a catch because you still retain decision making. You still retain decision making responsibility for that.
So we've covered the sort of emergency, the person leaves, what do we do in the short term, how do we post it? Now, let's go in, and we talked a little bit about recruitment. Let's go into the interview process. So you're looking to hire a reasonably high-level administrator, say principal, director, assistant superintendent. So you're looking at that level of position.
Yes.
All right. How do you structure the interview process? What are you looking for? What do you ask? What do you make them do?
So what I do, which is a consideration for people, I participate in the paper screening. I want to know who's coming in for a first round interview. We're going to talk about how you paper screen for jobs to begin with. But I want a good representative group of the organization to do first round interviews because I want their feedback.
Okay, so thinking about let's say, sake of an argument, a school district. Who's involved in the paper screening?
Paper screening depends upon what the process is.
Let's say cabinet level position.
A cabinet level position. Generally, the paper screening is probably going to be cabinet. It's going to be your superintendent. It is going to be based upon, hopefully, criterion developed through a group process that allows you to ascertain parental, student, and faculty needs.
So before this paper screening even happens, you've focus grouped those different
focus groups, and actually when we do superintendent search, we focus group, we survey, we have detailed conversations with individuals so we have an understanding of
what are people looking for? What do they want?
It's very similar. People want bosses to come in, administrators to come in who understand them, who take the time to get to know them, who understand instruction, who knows what it takes to put in place a program or a system.
Who aren't going to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yes, who
are not coming in with a deficit mindset.
Exactly right.
That is, everything you've done up until now is bad.
And that is exceedingly detrimental.
Absolutely.
Because you will, folks listening to the podcast, you will walk into situations where you will say to yourself, my goodness, and Mike and I have both been there, my goodness, what have you people been doing? But that's not helpful to those individuals.
And I'll tell you what, that's another podcast, the entry podcast.
The entry.
The entry plan. But we're not going to talk about that now. So you've identified the essential elements of the ideal candidate from your focus groups, and now you've got that group of people paper screening. Now, it's interesting because you said, and this is different from a lot of people, you said you are participating in that paper screening.
I participate.
Why?
I participate in that paper screening because
As the chief executive, what are you doing in the middle of that process?
depends upon the level.
I'm telling you, cabinet level. Why are you in it?
I'm in it because, number one, I don't want them to rule out people that have a background that is not necessarily traditional. I'm looking for leadership skills, the ability to prioritize and to deliver.
And I think, additionally, an unintended positive consequence of that is that if you're in on the initial level, you are not letting anybody through that you couldn't live with.
Correct.
Because at the end of the process, they're going to send some number of people to you, and if, God forbid, you weren't involved in the beginning, and they send 3 people to you who are just, non-starters, what are you going to do?
You're not going to do anything. I do not participate in the first round interviews because I want feedback on individuals.
So feedback. All right, so here we go. So we've done the paper screening. There's a group going to the first round interviews. The chief executive does not participate in that.
I don't participate in that.
I
no.
typically don't either. Even as the number 2, I'm not in it.
But you have to make it clear to interviewing committees they are advisory. I want their candid feedback.
Give me strengths. Give me areas of growth.
Yes.
That's it.
Because the reality is this comes into contextual leadership or leadership in context, the ability to navigate an organization. If someone's going to start out with a hurdle in their place, they probably will not be successful. I want to know what the feedback is from our different constituency groups.
And then, and I have found too that will inform the questions that you ask moving forward. Because, so might be a first round, there might be a second round with scripted questions, but particularly if we're talking about a cabinet level position or even a principal, there's a final meeting with that chief executive, whether it's the superintendent or whoever supervises the principals, where it's very candid, where I can take the feedback from all those groups and I can look at this person and say, hey, one of the things that came out in the interview was that you were a little off-putting. People felt like you weren't approachable. If you got that feedback, what would you do about it?
Right. So, often it takes 3 rounds when you do this because the third round would be with me or with a chief executive or with a cabinet. And you get
depending on the position.
When you get the opportunity to have, I think, a more of a professional conversation about this stuff, I'm looking for fit. I'm looking for the ability to deliver on things that we need to have done. And hiring is not a perfect line item thing.
I would argue it's more of an art than
It's
a
an
science.
art, and we've all been wrong. I've been wrong. We've all been wrong. However, hiring out of convenience, out of what the consensus says, is not always the best thing.
Say more about that.
Well, let's talk about oftentimes, and we'll go back to the beginning of this conversation, where when there's an opening that occurs, people want to know who their boss is. They'll often go to and run to the most comfortable individual. That may not be the individual. They may be a great person. That may not be the individual that moves the organization forward. When you really poke down and dive into the things on that, it's about adult convenience. It's not necessarily about what moves the organization forward. So you can often split the difference. I never want to bring somebody in whose idea is, or on the idea that they are the person that's going to clean house. Not a permanent position. That is not...
An interim, fine.
An interim could, but not a permanent position because they won't survive. And I don't want to ever hire anybody that I don't think is going to survive in a position. It's not fair to them, their family, anybody else.
So you've done the interviewing, and it gets to you. So this, I think, is as much instructive for the hirers as it is for the candidate. So that final conversation. So this is it. So you might be the one. You might be one of 2. Now you're coming in for the informal conversation with the decision maker. Whether it's the superintendent, the COO, the deputy superintendent, whoever it is, how does that conversation go?
Well, I'm looking for the ability to interact with the team that we've built.
It's a first date in a lot of ways.
Correct. The ability to interact with the team that we've built, the complementary skills, because I don't want the echo chamber. That's never good for an organization.
So let's pause on that, because we have not really gone down that rabbit hole and unpacked it. The echo chamber is something that you are trying to avoid as a leader at all costs.
At all costs.
And how do you do it?
Well, you need an honest assessment of your organization, and the skills that you have will lead you to, you need someone with other perspectives and skills. But it's hard, because the hardest thing for adults to do is look in the mirror and be honest about themselves. So sometimes it's the interim who says, you really need something like this. They're objective. It goes back to another conversation that we've had. But the reality of it is, a leader that's going to be successful over the long period of time does not enlist the echo chamber, because they will ultimately miss stuff that will lead them to being not successful and the organization not successful. You can look at Lincoln, you can look at Eisenhower.
And those presidents constructed cabinets of people with arguably disparate views. I mean, that's an understatement.
Disparate views, and I would say Eisenhower in World War II brought his biggest naysayers, de Gaulle and Montgomery, in because he valued their opinion. And it was a management thing too, politically, but there were opinions that people needed to understand differently. So I know my skill set. I have to be honest about that. And I had to bring in people like you. I had to bring in people who had maybe...
Because you and I, we have different skill sets.
Very different backgrounds, too.
Yep.
I was an economics major. I was a systems organizational guy. You are a instructional guru of sorts, and
Guru might be a stretch.
it might be a stretch, but it's true.
We'll own it. I'll own it.
And I may have just been young enough to understand that what I didn't understand, and hire appropriately for it.
Well, I think, and that requires a bit of self-awareness that I think sometimes young neophyte leaders sometimes miss, is that you really have to take a look at your blind spots, your areas of weakness, where you are not strong, and then hire people. Have the self-confidence to hire people to fill in those holes.
It's interesting because if you look at a lot of technological organizations, their CEOs may or may not have a technology background.
Well, what ends up happening with these startups is they start up with a bunch of technology guys, and then as soon as the company gets big, what do?
They go to business guys.
They go find business guys to be the CEOs.
That's correct. But you still have the technology guys. If you freeze out the tech guys, you'll lose your base.
Absolutely.
So it's a balance of a lot of different things. And I think the best thing, if I'm a building principal and I have a couple of APs that I can hire, I look at balance. Who has strengths and weaknesses in the area that I need them?
Right. And it's important to not only to have that self-awareness, but also to have those conversations with the team that you're working with. To say, all right, folks, we have this opening. What do we need? Like, what are we missing here around the table that's going to help us do our collective jobs better?
And if you don't have the luxury of an interim, have somebody come in from the outside for a day or two and just like process with you. Do a survey. Maybe have conversations. Do some focusing with people to say, what exactly is the thing that we're looking for?
And I think that's important to have somebody come in from the outside, because you, as the decision maker, you also need to be part of that conversation. You can't be part of it if you're trying to facilitate the discussion.
No, you want to be a participant, not the purveyor of. And because the purveyor of, people could say, well, you gerrymandered this or that, the other thing, you didn't hear us, what have you. Participate as a person who has input just like anybody else.
So let's say, this person comes in. What do you ask this person in that final interview? What do you want to know? What are you looking for? Because I know what I'm looking for, and I know what I'm going to ask. What are you thinking?
The first thing I want to know is their reflection on the process itself. The questions they were asked, how they answered, their intuitive perspective.
You give them a second crack at it. Let's see if they were reflective.
I want to know their intuitive, did they pick up stuff in the interview process? Because if they didn't, that's a red flag for me. Because if they don't, then they don't understand context. In which case, as we go way back to the beginning here, context leads to being successful.
Absolutely.
I want to know, do they understand what they're walking into? And how are they going to manage that? And what does it look like from their perspective?
All right, what else?
Do they have questions? I'm interested in their questions.
So from that, I'm gathering it's not okay to not have questions.
No, I want to know, are they inquisitive? Do they? It leads me. Those questions lead me to believe. Do they have an understanding of the role? Do they get where they're going to? That type of stuff.
One of the things I like to ask is, what's going to be the biggest challenge moving from your current role into this position? Like, what are you going to have to work on the most? Because there's going to be things that you can do, and there's going to be things that you struggle with. What are going to be those struggles, and how are you going to overcome them?
Yeah, it's that self-reflective piece of not everything's going to go like you think. So can you reassess and reevaluate and move forward in a different direction? And how are you going to do that, by the way? Who are you going to talk to? Who's going to be involved in those conversations?
Who are you going to talk to?
That's correct. Absolutely.
The other thing I want to know, too, is how does this person respond to constructive feedback? Because ultimately, there is going to come a time where I'm going to have to poke him or her in the chest and say, you messed this up. So let's talk about it.
We all have that.
So how do you get at that in that final interview?
I think it's, that's a hard one, Mike. But I think if you ask those insightful questions and you understand a person is self-reflecting, you're going to be able to...
Which you're going to pick up throughout the interview.
You're going to pick up. I'm going to say, what would you have done differently in the interview process? What do you think of what people said? Give me an example of a situation where you had to make a decision, you did something where you thought better of it later, and how did you rectify that? I want a self-reflective person who understands that we're not perfect and that we all make decisions that sometimes are wrong, but how are you going to go about rectifying that?
How are you going to make it better?
How are you going to make it better?
And ultimately, in the face of growth-producing feedback, what do? Do you shut down, or do you take it and get better?
I think at the end of the day, we've all, no matter who it is, have had our fails, we've had our successes. And success is easy. Failure is what takes people to the next level. And when you fail, what do you do about it? That's what I want to know.
Yeah. Do you gird your loins and get ready for the next one, or do you fold your tent and go home?
And how do you gird your loins? Do you dig in and do you fight? Or do you look reflectively and say, how do we do this differently? How can I do this differently?
Dan White, thank you. I think a great conversation on how to build your team. So thank you.
Mike, thank you, and good night.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the School Leadership Show, a podcast for aspiring and practicing school leaders. Send your comments, questions, and show ideas to me, Mike, at schoolleadershipshow.com. And please consider rating the podcast in iTunes and leaving a comment. And definitely pass the show along to your colleagues.